Hi everyone, it's Mike from Lanzarote Information with another Lanzarote information video for you. And this week we're continuing our series of stories. So we've done the story of Puerto del Carmen and various other parts of the island. And today we are going to do the story of Arrecife, which I'm sure you all know is the capital of Lanzarote. Now I need to apologise for any weirdness in the lighting of this video. I have a skylight above my head, and because of the time of the day, the sun is streaming down through it, sort of on half of me. So I'll kind of try and avoid doing anything like this and whiting myself out, but I'm relaxed about it because at the end of the day, you're not watching these videos to look at my face, you're watching them to see the images I post along with them and also to hear the story that I'm telling. Now, I said that most of you will know that Arrecife is the capital of Lanzarote, but did you know that it wasn't for several hundred years after the Spanish conquest? Now, when Jean de Betancourt and his soldiers conquered Lanzarote, they searched around the island for a likely capital, and in the end they settled on Teguise. And that was for a number of reasons, because the biggest issue that was facing Lanzarote through the Middle Ages, and indeed right up until the 18th century, was from pirates. And putting the capital anywhere along the coast or at lower levels was deemed a bad idea because it would make it very difficult to defend the capital of the island from the pirates. And that's why they settled on Teguise. And I mean, if you look at the topography of the island, or you've travelled up to Teguise, you'll see that it's at quite a high level, several hundred metres above sea level. But also at one side of it, there is a very high hill on which they were able to put a castle, which was the main defence for what was then the capital of the island. The rumour is that there are tunnels that run from Teguise to the castle so that people could escape incoming pirate hordes. I've been told that by a lot of people. I've been told by some people that they have seen them, but I've never seen them myself. So I don't know if it's just folklore or whether it's really the case. But soon after the conquest by the Spanish, as I say, Teguise became the capital not just of Lanzarote, but of the whole of the Canary Islands, because this was the first island that they conquered. So the original Canarian Parliament building still sits there in the centre of Teguise. It is the most historic town on the island and has so much history going back to the earliest days of the conquest, which took place in 1402. And Teguise remained the capital of Lanzarote for around 450 years. So as you'll find out in a moment, Arrecife didn't become the capital until much, much later. But this video is all about Arrecife, so let's start talking about the capital as it is today. Now, despite not being chosen as the capital, Arrecife very quickly became an important harbour for the island of Lanzarote because of its natural benefits. It had not only a sort of natural harbour where Puerto Neos is and is still a harbour, but it also had a reef off the coast of the town, which made it quite difficult to navigate. And that meant that ships that you wanted to come in could be navigated easily through the reef, but marauding pirates, foreign navies arriving and wanting to come and batter the town struggled to get through the reefs, and many ships were wrecked on the reefs. And in fact, Arrecife is the Spanish word for reef, so it's named after the reef that protects the town. Now, we need to know that the original plan for invading and conquering the Canary Islands was really not about owning this sort of relatively small piece of real estate in the Atlantic. It was all about being able to use it as a staging post for the conquest of the New World. And that's why the Spanish king hired Jean de Betancourt to go and take the islands in 1402. But actually taking all of the Canaries took another couple of hundred years. So it wasn't until the 16th century that the Canaries were settled and kind of all under control of the Spanish government. And it was at that point that Arrecife really came into its own. As the easternmost island, it was kind of the first stopping point for any ships sailing down from Spain, down the coast of Africa, and then turning right to go to the Americas, North and South America. And many ships began to stop in Arrecife at that time to take on coal and wood and supplies for the sailors to sustain them for the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. But it also became a great stopping point for ships coming the other way, which were often laden with the treasure that had been taken by the Spanish from, for example, South America. So that would include gold and potatoes and chilies and all kinds of things that were being discovered in the New World and being brought back to the Iberian Peninsula. And again, those ships would often stop, for example, in Arrecife or Las Palmas de Gran Canaria and offload their goods into warehouses that had been set up around the ports. And then they would turn around and go back, and smaller ships that could comfortably travel the shorter distance would come down from, for example, Valencia or other ports in Andalusia to pick that stuff up and take it on to the Spanish mainland. So Lanzarote and the other Canary Islands very much became, in the 16th and 17th centuries, these kind of two-way trading posts where ships would supply themselves in both directions and also offload a lot of the product that they were bringing back from the Americas. And it wasn't just product, it was also people. So bear in mind at this time that Spain was colonizing major parts of South America, an awful lot of North America as well, the area we know of today as California, Mexico, of course, New Mexico and Texas were populated by people from mainland Spain. So if they wanted to go and start a new life in the New World, they would often get a ship to one of the Canary Islands and then hang around there until they could pick one up going across the ocean. So all through the 16th century, Arrecife was becoming more and more prosperous with this traffic in goods and people. And in 1574, the first church was built there. There were a lot of buildings, by all accounts, warehousing right down on the seafront, but also buildings for providing apartments for all the workers who worked in the ports, transporting these goods around the place. But whilst Teguise, as the capital, was very well protected, Arrecife wasn't, and they had an ongoing problem with pirates. And in 1593, a bunch of British pirates basically destroyed the whole town of Arrecife. And they stole a lot of the goods that were in the warehouses and took men away as slaves to sail on their ships, and also women away to turn them into wives and do all the usual stuff that pirates do. And it was in this period, the sort of mid-1500s to the mid-1600s, that a decision was taken to rebuild Arrecife because it was becoming a valuable asset to the Canary Islands and particularly to Lanzarote. The first thing they did was rebuild the church, and the church is there still today, Iglesia San Ginés, which is right in the centre of Arrecife. But they also decided to fortify the town in order to protect it from the pirates. So the first fort they built was Castillo San Gabriel, which is on the little island right off the end of the main street in Arrecife. And a bridge was built going out to it called the Puente de las Bolas, the Bridge of Balls, so named because of the two cannonballs that were on the drawbridge that goes out to it. And the second castle that was built was Castillo San Jose. That was built a little bit later, but that was about providing cannon fire for any ships actually entering the harbour of Puerto Neos. So we move on now to the 19th century, or the 1800s. And Arrecife now is a well-protected town. It has a lot of commerce going through it in terms of people and stuff. There's a lot of warehousing built on the front. There are buildings going further back up towards Argana, the barrio of Argana, towards the back of Arrecife, where people are living and working in jobs, and there are shops and shopkeepers, and it's a smaller version of the city we know today. With the threat of pirates disappearing thanks to the fortifications and the soldiers and sailors who were defending it, the decision was made to relocate Lanzarote's central government from Teguise down into Arrecife and therefore make Arrecife the capital of the island. And that happened in 1852. And about 70 years later, Lanzarote joined with Fuerteventura to create the province of Las Palmas. So Arrecife started to go from strength to strength in this period from, let's say, the 1850s to the 1970s. And there were two key industries that made it successful, in addition to still acting as a port between the Americas and Europe. And those two industries, the first of them was salt production. And if you drive on the road that goes past Puerto Neos, you'll see the remains of the salt pans, which were operational right up until the 1990s. And there were massive salt pans going back in tiers from the ocean. There were windmills on there that would pump the seawater into the salt pans, and the salt was collected from them when it was dried out by the sun. And that salt was both sold as a condiment around the world, but it was also really important in the early years before refrigeration in order to enable the fishermen of Arrecife to preserve their catches by drying them out in barrels of salt. And I've already hinted at what the second major industry was for Arrecife, and that was fishing, because the waters around the Canary Islands were replete in this period with all kinds of species of fish. And the two industries really worked hand in hand, because the locally harvested salt would be used to pack the locally caught fish into barrels, and then so much of it would be sent back to mainland Spain, across Europe, and even around the world. Now, believe it or not, by the early 1970s, Lanzarote had the largest sardine fishing fleet. That was a good one. The largest sardine fishing fleet in Europe, and the harbour became extremely busy. And there were canning factories created all around the harbour area with conveyor belts which took the fish from the fishing boats as they came in straight into the factories. So by this time, with canning discovered, there was no need to salt the fish anymore. They could be preserved in cans in olive oil or in some cases vinegar. And Lanzarote really became the epicenter of the sardine and sardine canning industry around the world. And if you ate sardines, as I did, out of tins as a kid years ago, they were almost certainly caught in this area and canned in this area. But unfortunately, the size of that fleet really started to decimate the fish population in the area, and certainly the sardine population, and it just was not sustainable, with boats from the Canary Islands and also from Morocco just making huge catches and turning them around and sending them around the world. Something had to give, and a series of quotas were agreed in the 1970s by all the interested parties of this area of the world to greatly reduce the amount of fishing that was going on in order to sustain enough fish to keep us going in the future. So that decimated the fishing industry here, and it reduced in size dramatically. The sardine factories were closed down and eventually fell into ruin, and Arrecife needed to do something else. Now, two tacks were taken, one more successful than the other, but the first was for Arrecife to become the engine of Lanzarote, if that makes sense. And we're going to wind back to the 60s now and talk about how Arrecife became the engine of Lanzarote. And the first thing they wanted to do was to provide power for the island, electricity for the island. Now, if you go back to 1959, for example, there was one very tiny power station operating in Arrecife that only provided electricity for Arrecife, and it was only during certain hours of the day, and it would be switched off at night, for example. So the rest of the island, apart from this little bit of Arrecife, didn't have any electricity as late as the 1950s. What happened next is that an old World War II British destroyer, believe it or not, that had been converted into an electricity ship, was bought in by the Cabildo of Lanzarote, and it was docked in Puerto Neos, and the steam turbines of that ship were used to act as a power station for the island. And that would run 24 hours a day, and an electricity grid was basically created going out from that ship across the island, and through the 1960s, the island of Lanzarote was gradually electrified. The next biggest issue facing Lanzarote at the time was a lack of water, and the island completely relied on water ships coming in, bringing in water from other islands, or whatever could be captured from the very meagre rainfall we were having each year. So Lanzarote actually became one of the very first places in Europe to have a desalination plant. The desalination plant in Arrecife went online in 1964, and finally everyone on the island had relatively inexpensive access to fresh water. Now, one of the issues with that was the desalination plant was using an awful lot of the electricity supply that was coming from the old World War II destroyer. So a decision was also made to build a power station. And they started work on that in the 1960s, and by around 1970 that was up and running, and the electricity ship could be consigned back to its port in Cadiz. So we've now reached the early 1970s, and Lanzarote has switched into this sort of role as being both the government centre of Lanzarote, but also the engine providing the electricity for the island and the water for the island. But there was something else they wanted to do. They'd seen the success of the beginnings of tourism in Puerto del Carmen, and it was decided that they could probably take advantage of the beautiful natural beach at Playa del Reducto, and a decision was made to build a high-rise hotel in Arrecife, the Gran Hotel, with the thought that this new Gran Hotel right on the beach in Lanzarote's capital would attract a lot of tourists to it. Now, I need to talk about this for a moment, because a lot of people, whenever you talk about the Gran Hotel, will say things like, oh, Cesar Manrique would be turning in his grave, and how did they get permission to build the Gran Hotel when there's a rule in Lanzarote that you can't have high-rise hotels? Well, I need to tell you the story about that. And the first thing you should know is that Cesar Manrique was very much involved with the build of the Gran Hotel. He was on the island at the time, and he was part of it. He actually designed some of the murals that went on inside. He designed the greenery around it, and a bit of the entrance area as well. He certainly didn't oppose the building of this first multi-story building in Lanzarote, but it did trigger that thought in his head, and it was soon after this, in the 1980s, that he said, well, you know, maybe it's good that we've got one high-rise building on the island, but let's not have any more beyond that. So yeah, it's a slightly different interpretation of it, but the reality is the Gran Hotel failed dismally. Arrecife just didn't have the stuff that tourists want. It didn't have lots of foreign-friendly bars and restaurants. The beach didn't have sunbeds on it. The access to other parts of the island from Arrecife in that time, in that period, wasn't that easy. And the hotel really never made any money. And in 1991, the company that was promoting it and had it built literally just walked away. They just closed it up one day, locked it up and left the building as it was. Now, almost inevitably, squatters got in there and started living in it, and somehow they managed to start a fire in 1994 which basically gutted the whole building, and it was a wreck, a hulk, with just the skeleton of the outside of the building remaining upright. And it was still like that. Bear in mind, the fire happened in 1994. It was still like that when we moved to the island 6 years later. It was an absolute eyesore. And it's worth me talking about that period when we first moved here. I know it's 25 years ago now, but it illustrates how much Arrecife has changed in those intervening 25 years. So the first thing you used to see in those days when you drove into Arrecife was this burnt out hulk of a building standing up next to what was still a beautiful beach. When you went beyond that and around the corner to Chaco San Ginés, it was very run down. It really didn't look great. It was an area where there were a lot of unsavory characters, let's say, hanging around, and somewhere we didn't particularly enjoy going, although obviously we had to spend time in Arrecife, and there was no marina. The marina just didn't exist in those days. And the first step in bringing Arrecife up to the lovely, thriving place I would happily live in today was the rebuilding of the Arrecife Gran Hotel, and that was done in the year 2001. So 7 years after the fire that burnt it out. It was rebuilt as a 5-star, it was done tastefully, it was done elegantly, and it's been a roaring success ever since then. The second thing was the construction of Marina Lanzarote, turning part of the harbour area into a marina for leisure boats. And it isn't the marina's success really that has transformed the island. It was the response of the people who had businesses, bars and restaurants in Chaco San Ginés, because what they did was suddenly really up their game, and they turned Chaco San Ginés into a really vibrant, fantastic area with lots of eateries, great live music, bars that sell craft beers and all kinds of interesting stuff, and it lifted that whole area, the competition or the perceived competition coming in from the marina. And the next step in the revitalisation of Arrecife is going to be the restoration of one of the original sardine factories, which is currently a ruin. And the idea is to rebuild that really as a testament to the workers, both the fishermen and the men and women who worked in the canning factories, telling their story. And I'm really looking forward to that opening up. So there you go, that's the Arrecife story. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you so much for watching. If you've got any questions, just put a comment in below. I read all of the comments. I will always try and reply to your questions. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give us a like. It really does help us. Thank you once again. Bye for now, everyone. Bye.